Hi everyone, Deacon Ed McCormick here on this beautiful July Sunday morning. And this morning I want to talk to you about the good news of the Holy Spirit and St. Paul's replacement theory. Now this morning in Mass we heard St. Paul chapter 8 of the letter of Romans. And in the beginning of this chapter he says the following. He tells us, don't live from the flesh, but live from the Spirit. He's telling us not to serve the flesh, but to live from the Spirit of God, because the Spirit of God dwells in you. And when he says you, he's talking about each of us personally, but he's talking about the community. Now, this doesn't sound like good news, and it often confuses people. So I need to clarify what Paul's saying, because people can hear this, don't live according to the flesh, live according to the Spirit, and they can think Paul's saying I shouldn't live in my body. I should live some kind of spiritual life. And what does that mean? If I wasn't in my body, I couldn't speak. I couldn't move my hands. You wouldn't see me. And it's impossible to not be in your body. In fact, our bodies are gifts from God. God's created them and given them to us, including the oxygen, this environment, all of this. So Paul is not talking about the body. In fact, the word in Greek for body is soma. And in this passage, he doesn't use that word. He uses the word in Greek sarx. It's the word for flesh. So when Paul says don't live according to the flesh, he's not saying don't live in your body. Instead, he's saying don't serve all of those forces that disrupt and destroy relationships. Envy, jealousy, greed, injustice, rage, violence, corruption. All the forces that we know tear apart families and societies and cause wars and cause the destruction of whole communities and societies and even God's creation. Those are the forces that Paul equates with the flesh. I encourage you to read Galatians 5 to see a list of these. So when Paul says don't live according to the flesh, he's saying don't hold on to your grudges. Don't be driven by your resentments and your pain and your loss and your emptiness. Instead, live from the Spirit of God. Now, he has this next line, which is really stunning. He says, if the Spirit of the one who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, then live according to that Spirit. Now notice what he's saying. The Spirit of the one who raised Jesus from the dead. The one who raised Jesus from the dead, of course, is God the Father. And only the Spirit of God could turn a dead person into one who is now alive and raised and living a new kind of life. It's the Spirit of God poured out from the Father onto the dead body of Jesus that raises him up and transforms him. That Spirit, that power, is now dwelling in us, in our community. And it's only because that power that raised Jesus now kind of envelops the Christian community and animates us and energizes us. It's only because of that we can grow free from the forces of the flesh. Because Lord knows that resentment, that bitterness, that rage, that sense of injustice, that greed, all of those things that drive our decisions in family life, in our corporations, in our governments, all of those destructive forces, they're hard to resist and say no to. But because the Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead dwells in us and dwells between us and in our community, we can be freed from those forces and live a new life. And this takes me to Paul's replacement theory. In chapter 5 of Romans, Paul describes life without Christ as slavery to those forces. He says we're godless, we're irreverent, we don't follow God's laws. He says that we're sinners, We're slaves to these destructive forces, and we're enemies of God. But because of the death and resurrection of Jesus and the outpouring of the Spirit, we have now been made friends of God. And what has replaced all of those destructive forces in our relationships, in our Christian community, is the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Christ. And it produces, Paul says, it grows these fruits. And these fruits are love, patience, peace, joy, gentleness, forgiveness, self-control. All the ways of relating that make a new kind of existence and a new kind of community possible. This is why the gift of the Holy Spirit is very practical, and it is good news. Because we need to keep saying no to those destructive forces and destructive motives, and keep living out of the new life of the Spirit. Our families need this, our friendships, our Christian communities, our entire world. This is the good news of the Spirit. Say no to the old ways and say yes to Christ's way of living. See you in the next video.